Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lucy and today I'm talking about my favourite fantasy books of all time. So if you're new to my channel, you may not know I'm a huge fantasy book reader and it is my favourite genre. I read a lot of YA fantasy. I'm trying to get into more adult fantasy, so do leave your recommendations for me down in the comments. But today I wanted to talk you through my all-time favourite fantasy reads. If you'd like more videos like this, then please do hit that subscribe button for weekly bookish videos. And now let's get on with the video. So to me, a fantasy novel needs to have a blend of things to make it my favourite. One, it needs to have incredible characterisation, it needs to have amazing world building, and I think the most important thing for me with a fantasy novel, which you might not get all the time, is it needs to have great pacing. I have read a lot of very long fantasy books that just don't have the right pacing for me, and I think all of these books I can firmly say have incredible pacing, so you're not going to feel like it's a long slog. Okay, so let's get into my first pick, which is The Winner's Curse by Marie Rutkowski. So this is book one in the Winners series or Winners trilogy, and this is basically a Roman-inspired fantasy series that is extremely richly detailed. It has beautiful world building and it has characters that you cannot trust and that you are somehow rooting for the whole way through. So people were telling me for years to read the Winners series and I just never got round to it. However, I think about a year ago or 2 years ago, I finally got round to reading it and I was so impressed because this is of course billed as YA fantasy. It's kind of one of those like very popular YA series. However, what I wasn't prepared for was the level of world building and skill that this series really has. This is also the author's debut series, I believe, which is even more impressive because the level of detail to this fantasy world, the pacing, as I said, so important, but it really is there. And basically this book is about this world, as I said, Roman inspired. You can really kind of feel the influence there. And it follows our main character called Kestrel. So Kestrel is the daughter of a very influential general, and one day she is in town and she stumbles upon a slave auction, and it's there that she catches the eye of Aaron, who is a slave. She ends up buying Aaron as a slave, and that basically sets off the premise of our whole entire novel. Let me just say that Aaron is kind of not initially what he seems. He has many plots and a very kind of detailed past which does crop up. I think the first novel is a really nice setup for the entire trilogy. After the first novel it gets very war heavy as we are kind of battling the kind of like establishment versus the people, and there is a war brewing on the horizon. So this series really is one of my favourites. I was so impressed by how well crafted it was, how addictive the books were, and just how lovable some of the characters were as well. So I would urge you all to read this. If you're a traditional fantasy lover, I think you will really love the Winners trilogy. Okay, next up is a kind of traditional choice, and if you're a fan of my channel or you've been watching me for a while, you will know I'm a big Sarah J Maas fan. So Sarah J Maas is one of the kind of key YA fantasy authors out there. And basically I've read all of her novels. I love all of her novels, but I think the one series that stands out for me is A Court of Thorns and Roses. So this is the first book in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. The second book is A Court of Mist and Fury, and the third book is A Court of Wings and Ruin. So I loved all of her books. I think the second book in the series was my particular favourite. But the kind of setup of this series is that it is a very kind of like high fantasy series. The first book is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, so it kind of weaves in those kind of fantasy elements that way. It also features fairies, so this is a world where fairies and humans are kind of at odds with each other. The fairies are kind of the dominating force in this world, and basically our main character Feyre has to hunt food for her family, her human family, and basically she stumbles upon this fairy called Tamlin, who is part of the Spring Court, and it kind of sets off the whole series there, and we see lots of different fairy courts, and there is of course a war in this series as well. I feel like I really do like fantasy series where there's like wars or there's a kind of like battle element to it. What I particularly love about the Court of Thorns and Roses series is how beautifully told the stories are. There's lots of humour in here. It's a really well-paced fantasy series, although the last book is ginormous, but I did rush through that really quickly because I just wanted to know how it ends. So this is definitely on the more kind of like high fantasy spectrum. It isn't, you know, urban fantasy or epic fantasy. This is very kind of fairy tale-esque, and I think it really, really works. And it is one of my favorite series of all time, so that's why it's in this video, obviously. I really, really enjoyed it, and I think if you've never read the series yet and you're a fantasy fan, I think you will enjoy it. Okay, my third favorite fantasy series is, of course, the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. So the first book in the Mistborn series is called The Final Empire, and this was my first introduction to Brandon Sanderson, who is kind of a king of the adult fantasy genre, although he has written YA fantasy as well. So I first read the Mistborn series a few years ago now. I absolutely fell in love with it. I think the one thing that really intrigued me was how unusual his fantasy world was. So basically we follow the story of Vin, who is a 16-year-old orphan. Then she meets a guy called Kelsier, who is kind of this master criminal, and he essentially trains her in something called allomancy, which is the magic of metals and how to manipulate metals. And it was kind of the world that first attracted me. The world is really striking and unusual. This is a world where ash falls from the sky. There are mists that dominate the townscape at night. This is a very dark world led by a corrupt ruler called the Lord Ruler. And it's all set off very bleak, but the one kind of central premise of book one is for Vin and Kelsier to bring down the Lord Ruler and end this kind of miserable existence that they're living in. So I really enjoyed the setup of this. I really enjoyed Vin and Kelsier's dynamic. I love Vin as a character. I love Kelsier even more as a character. And there are lots of big, big twists and turns in this series. I must say that these books are big. They are quite chunky. If you're new to fantasy, you may be a little bit kind of put off, but the pacing really is there. So I think you will fly through these quite quickly. Brandon Sanderson really is a master of the craft, and I am desperate to read more books by him. I haven't read his other series yet, like the Stormlight Archive, but I do really want to get into that. But the Mistborn series, I think, is a really good place to start in the Sanderson universe, the Cosmere as it's called. But I really enjoyed Mistborn. I think The Final Empire, I just remember first reading that book and falling in love with it. So it's earned its place on this list as one of my favourite fantasy novels of all time. The next book and the fourth pick is The Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo. So this came out a few years ago now, and Six of Crows is the most fun fantasy novel ever. This basically features 6 criminals who essentially have to perform this heist in order to get this treasure, essentially. So they're on this kind of heist mission, and the story basically takes each of their perspectives in turn, so 6 of Crows. So there's 6 points of view in this novel. You may think that sounds a bit crazy to be introduced to 6 different points of view, 6 different voices. However, Leigh Bardugo is just a master of this. And the product of this is a brilliant fantasy novel, so much fun, loads of banter, really kind of like epic quests, and I think the dynamics between all the characters is really unusual. Each of the characters has their own detailed backstory. It's just a really unusual but brilliant fantasy series. I love that it's a duology, it's not too long, and the world itself is brilliant. It's part of a larger world called the Grishaverse, which Leigh Bardugo set up in her first series called the Grisha series. I adored that series. I read that and just completely consumed it. But in my opinion, Six of Crows is a much stronger proposition, a stronger novel, characters that I loved even more so than the Grisha series characters. I just really connected to this world. So I adore the Six of Crows duology. I feel like I need to reread it at some point because it's just so good. And finally, my fifth pick is His Dark Assassin series by Robin Lefevre. So the first book in this series is Grave Mercy, and then we go on to Dark Triumph, and then Mortal Heart. So basically, if you're unfamiliar with the series, it was popular on BookTube a long time ago. Like, I'm talking kind of maybe 5-6 years ago, like back when I started this channel, essentially. But basically, His Dark Assassin is about a kind of like a collective of assassin nuns who answer to the god of death, and they get kind of missions to kill certain people and basically avenge the god of death, and they kind of answer to him. And this series is all set in the 1400s, I believe, in Brittany. So there's a real nice historical setting here that I particularly enjoy because I love historical settings for fantasy novels, and it just sets it off beautifully. So in the first book, Grave Mercy, one of our assassins has to go into the royal court of Brittany to assassinate essentially the crown prince. She ends up forming kind of a relationship with him. There is a beautiful romance plot like in each of the books, which I adore. Like, I love a romance in a fantasy novel, and luckily there's a great romance in each of these books in the His Dark Assassin series. The way that history is blended in with the kind of unique fantasy elements is really, really well done. Robin Lefevre is an excellent writer. This is YA, so it isn't maybe as challenging as some adult fantasy, but I think the world building is there, the characters are there, the pacing is on point. So those are my kind of key markers for a fantasy novel, and I'm happy to say this series definitely delivers. I will read anything Robin Lefevre writes. And I believe there is a kind of duology spin-off series called Courting Darkness, which follows another one of our assassins. So if you're interested in this world and you've already read those 3 novels in the His Dark Assassin series, you can read Courting Darkness to get more of that world. So everyone, those were my 5 favourite fantasy novels of all time. Obviously, I have a lot more to read. I haven't read a lot of adult fantasy. As I said, my introduction to fantasy was definitely via the YA route, and I'm definitely interested in getting recommendations from you all. So if you would like to leave any recommendations, please do leave them down in the comments below, and I will hopefully get around to reading those. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, again, please do subscribe, and I will see you next time with another video. Bye guys.